Well, good evening, Nietzsche friends and foes, and welcome to campus. My name is Brandon Warmke. I am Associate Professor of Philosophy at Bowling Green State University and visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy here at the Benson Center. The Benson Center's mission is to promote the study of the intellectual, artistic, and political traditions that characterize Western civilization. And central to that mission is our commitment to fostering dialogue about fundamental values and controversial questions, I think both of which we'll discuss tonight. The Benson Center is therefore proud to host this panel discussion this evening on Nietzsche. And I'd like to now turn over to Dr. Alex Priu, faculty fellow here at the Benson Center. Would you please join me in welcoming Alex?
Brandon forgot his beer. Thanks for coming here. This is our panel on Nietzsche and the future of Western civilization. Nietzsche famously said that sometimes when you look into the abyss looks into you. But sometimes when you look into the abyss, you see our four guests tonight. I say that partly in jest, but also partly because they all recognize and wrestle with the challenge of Nietzsche, as well as his great depth. What Nietzsche meant by there being an abyss, the German word Abgrund, is that there's an absence of a ground, that we come to recognize that a lot of the values that we've taken for granted were just that, taken for granted, perhaps even created, fictional, and therefore there's a real challenge that we're facing in a world where we cease to believe in these things. That's a serious thing to expose, and it puts us in a bit of a dilemma. I think all of our speakers here would agree with that basic assessment and that we have to wrestle with that. So we've invited four guests today, and I'll introduce each as they come up to speak for the diversity of views they represent and therefore the richness of conversation that they could engender. And so I'm very pleased to welcome all four of these gentlemen here tonight. Our first speaker is Dr. Stephen Pittz. He's Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual and Associate Professor and Chair of Political Science at the University of Colorado Springs, which is also where you started your academic career as an undergraduate, correct?
Actually, I was my freshman year was at CU Boulder.
Oh, okay.
And I lived in Kittredge West.
So you're really getting back to your roots now. Okay, good. He's the author of Recovering the Liberal Spirit, Nietzsche, Individuality, and Spiritual Freedom, and co-author with Joseph Postel of American Citizenship and Constitutionalism in Principle and Practice. He's also written on atomism or individualism, conspiracism in liberal democratic societies, and the ethics of creative destruction in entrepreneurship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Pittz as he talks to us about Nietzsche and Mill.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you to Alex and Paul and everyone who put this on. Been looking forward to this panel for a while, and I think this panel, because it's many people and also because we're going to have a question and answer session, not quite sure where it's going to go, which is always more fun, and I'm not even sure if I'll use all my time here. I just want to set up a paper that I wrote, talk a little bit about it. I am happy to be back in Boulder, and I was walking up here. As I said, I started my first year at Kittredge West, and I couldn't decide if I felt like I was coming home or if now I feel like a nervous 18-year-old again. But in any case, it's kind of fun to be right back so close. So I wrote a paper for this panel.
Would you like to turn the mic on?
Oh, it's off?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Better?
Yeah.
Okay. So I wrote a paper for this panel called Can a Liberal Be a Genius? Mill and Nietzsche on the Promise and Limits of Liberalism. All right, so it's kind of a mouthful. I just want to say a couple things about that title. And then I really want to talk about the motivation behind the paper. So first of all, liberal, what do we mean by liberal? This does not mean liberal or conservative in the contemporary political sense, right? This is liberalism as the umbrella political philosophy that starts in the 17th century, comes up to today. Many, many thinkers, right? But thinkers like John Locke or Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill or John Rawls and of course many others in between. But that's what I mean by liberal. And my guess is that when people say liberal on this panel, that's generally what they mean is like liberal political philosophy. Then genius. Well, what do I mean by genius? I'll talk a little bit about that, but the reason I care about that isn't just like, oh, well, it's interesting to try to think about geniuses. Was Einstein a genius and what made him tick sort of thing. It's not really the motivation. The motivation is more that genius is kind of shorthand for exemplary individuals that create models that can be emulated and looked up to in society. And they're usually cultural figures that warrant emulation. Then finally, the promise and the limits of liberalism. So the question is, and I'll use genius in this way, if liberalism as a political philosophy allows for or even supports and pushes on genius, ostensibly, and this link isn't perfect, and we can talk about questions about this link, I know many people might have them, but if the genius is supported and promoted in liberal societies, you would think that everyone, all citizens of a liberal society, would also have the ability within that regime to fulfill their potential. Right? So the question is, can liberalism let everybody fulfill their potential, live a flourishing life, live a good life? So that's the idea behind genius. And the idea of the promise and limits of liberalism is there's ways in which liberalism does promise this, that we can all maximize our potential, we can all flourish. But there's also ways that it limits it. Nietzsche certainly wanted to emphasize how it limits our ability to do that, maybe even erases it entirely. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. The other two important things to note is the thinkers I chose. Mill, John Stuart Mill, and Nietzsche. So quick show of hands, how many of you know John Stuart Mill to some degree? Okay, a good amount of you. A prototypical Enlightenment liberal. And then I'm assuming because you've come here, you at least have some interest in Nietzsche. These are very, very different thinkers, but they're both writing in the early stages of liberalism, or at least before we're in late stage liberalism or something like that, if you want to call it that. And John Stuart Mill is known as one of the forefathers of liberal thought. And they both wrote quite a bit about genius. Right? Mill had a piece called On Genius when he was younger in 1835, and then about 15 years later, he writes about it in his very famous book On Liberty. And then Nietzsche talks about geniuses throughout his work. He's got many, many sort of names for exemplary individuals. It can be a free spirit, it can be a new philosopher, it can be a superman or an overman, which many people like to talk about, but in my view actually gets too much press because he speaks about them less than he does the free spirit and the new philosopher. But in any case, so they both care about this issue. And they come at it very, very differently. For Mill, what is genius? What we might expect from an Enlightenment liberal. Genius has to do with the individual's use of reason. It has to do with openness to ideas. And most importantly, it has to do with independent discovery. All right? So discovery of new truths on your own. Geniuses discover new truths on your own. And for Mill, it's important that this is available to everyone. He's very democratic about the idea of genius, about the idea of realizing your own truths, realizing your own potential. Maybe not your own truth, sorry, that's a bad phrasing, but that each individual can discover the truth on their own, and that if they're doing it on their own, rather than, say, appealing to authority or just aping and imitating others, then that's an act of genius, right? Coming to truth on your own in your own way, that's an act of genius. So anybody can do this. And this leads to a flourishing life. It builds capacities, and there's all these other things that are important about it. So this is what we should expect from a liberal, especially from an Enlightenment liberal. For Nietzsche, genius is something different. It's not so much about independent discovery and the use of our reason. It's about force of will, or a strong spirit. He actually says things like spiritual force, an accrual of building up of spiritual force. That's what's important about genius. Okay, pretty different takes on genius. However, what I found in doing this paper, and I'm going to try to explain why I think this matters for liberalism in just a second. What I found when I was doing this paper is that Mill started to doubt, or at least change his opinion about what genius really is, and whether or not it's possible in liberal societies. He generally thinks it is possible, but he moves closer to Nietzsche's position as time goes on. So he starts out with this very Enlightenment perspective, use our reason, independent discovery, we can all be geniuses, we can all reach our potential. Then he starts, and on liberty, he starts to talk about things like the energetic individual. He starts to talk about the force of will, and looking at the few who really pull the species or push them up or pull them along in important ways. And this sounds a lot more like Nietzsche. So the question is, well, why might that be? Right? Why might that be? And one thing that we know about Mill, and also someone like Tocqueville, is they were more or less pro-liberal. Mill maybe more so than typical, more than Tocqueville, but still very pro-liberal. So I'm sure it wasn't a happy thing for Mill to think about genius as more rare. Nietzsche, on the other hand, is unabashedly critical of liberalism. Right? He has no problem saying the problem with liberalism is that it's very weak spiritually. It leads to spiritual emptiness for pretty much everybody. Right? It's just a degeneration of the human spirit. And so, we need to change this entirely. Then you look at Mill. Mill is trying to talk about spiritual force and energy as things go on. So he's realizing there's something to the Nietzschean critique, right? And that's why it's important to put the two together. Does this mean, though, that we should just give up on liberalism because we're somehow just acknowledging that our ceiling, you might want to say, is a lot lower? Well, I don't think that's what Mill ultimately concluded, right? Nietzsche did think that. And Nietzsche talks about the need to bring man back up, you might say, or regenerate man. And there's world historical figures that should be doing that. People like Napoleon, he calls a genius. He calls Goethe, the German poet, a genius. And what was so important about them is they were such powerful geniuses, they had such force of will, they could sort of create new values and impose those values on the whole culture or society that they were a part of. And Nietzsche says that's what we need. We need that. We need to have rank, we have to have hierarchy, and that's what we need to bring people up. And what you need is the dynamic tension. When we talk about spiritual force, there's a dynamic tension that occurs between the genius and, let's say, the rest of people in society. All right, so what does Mill think about that? Well, Mill kind of comes to the conclusion, maybe Nietzsche's right about one thing. You do need a state of dynamic tension. You need something to sort of push or propel people to greater heights, or at least to achieving their potential. Is it true that liberalism just levels all of us, makes us all mediocre, and that that's impossible? No, maybe we just need to find other places where that dynamic tension might occur, right? And I think that's where Mill starts to turn his eye, and then hopefully, in my paper, I think I take it a little bit further and make some of my own suggestions of where that dynamic tension may come from, right? Instead of the tension between the great and the rare and the common, or what Nietzsche would call the herd, you can see tension in other ways. The individual versus the community, or when you think about community or society as a sort of a container of collective opinion, that tells us in many ways, conform in all these ways. This is right, this is wrong. Taylor Swift is the best. You're not allowed to say no to that, right? But maybe there's like a little bit of tension when somebody says, I really don't like Taylor Swift songs, right? Maybe they're not that good. I know this is kind of a trite example, but that's the individual feeling some tension with collective opinion, right, with the rest of society. And the idea is that sort of spiritual tension, and we can extrapolate that and think about spiritual tension in a lot of different ways. That's the sort of thing that propels liberal citizens, right, to reach greater heights, or to achieve their own potential. So promise and limits of liberalism. On one hand, So the liberals, and I mean, I start this off as a partisan of liberalism. I think that we need to continue the liberal order. I think we should enhance it and make it better, but I'll throw my chips down there. But I think Mill also agrees with this, that Nietzsche's right about the limitations of liberalism. We're probably not going to have many more Goethes or Leonardo da Vinci's or Renaissance men who are just geniuses in every way, and somehow bring us to the whole society to higher states. Instead, we might find little geniuses, right? Less big genius, more little genius, something like that, right? Being simple. But there are ways for us in a liberal society to create dynamic tension, increase our spiritual force, and help everyone achieve their potential to the extent that they can. So anyway, I don't know how long I went, but I'll leave it there. There's many more things I can talk about from the paper, but I just wanted to set that up, and hopefully that'll end up with some good conversation.
Thank you, Stephen. Our second speaker is Professor Ronald Beiner. He's Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Toronto. He's the editor of Hannah Arendt's lectures on Kant's political philosophy. He's the author of What's the Matter with Liberalism, Civil Religion, Political Philosophy, What It Is and Why It Matters, and perhaps most relevantly, his 2018 book, Dangerous Minds. He's currently on work on a book on Moses and political philosophy, which sounds very interesting. He's here to talk today about the effect of Nietzsche on the far-right vanguard today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Beiner.
Thanks a lot. So I'd like to thank Alex and Paul for having organized this event and for having invited me to participate in it. Okay, I want to begin with a quote from Keith Ansel Pearson. It's from his review of Malcolm Bull's 2011 book, Anti-Nietzsche. Ansel Pearson writes, I would have liked to have learned more about Bull's motivations in writing Anti-Nietzsche. Why Anti-Nietzsche now? What reactionary forces and groupings centered on Nietzsche are at work at present? And more than this, concertedly working against the progressive forces of the left? I know of none. The scary Nietzsche who rants about breeding and European ruling castes, Ansel Pearson assures us, now looks decidedly dated by his 19th century context. Well, these are sentences, I would say, that it would be impossible for Ansel Pearson to write today, since we know very clearly what are the current day reactionary forces and groupings centered on Nietzsche. Leading figures in the alt-right proclaim their devotion to him. We have Richard Spencer, for instance, who was quoted in Graham Wood's profile of him in The Atlantic as saying that having been red-pilled by Nietzsche was decisive in turning Spencer into the concerted fascist that he then became. Spencer has also written the following. I had first encountered Nietzsche's writings in the year 2000 in my extracurricular readings while an undergraduate at the University of Virginia. Reading him marked a turning point in my life. Indeed, I find it hard to imagine what my approach to thinking about society, politics, and religion would be without Nietzsche as educator. And similar sentiments have been voiced by Greg Johnson, another leading figure in the contemporary alt-right. He writes, Nietzsche had an immense influence on the entire conservative revolutionary movement in Germany, which includes Spengler, Junger, and Schmidt. He also influenced Evola, Benoit, Guillaume Fay, Dugan, Jack Donovan, Spencer, and me, meaning Greg Johnson, who's a Nazi. There simply would not have been a modern radical right without Nietzsche. Nor should one overlook the strong debt to Nietzsche in the writings of Jason Giorgiani and Bronze Age pervert, also known as whose real identity is Costin Alamariu, we now know, the latter of whom wrote a doctoral thesis on Nietzsche and Plato. The ferocious anti-liberalism and hatred of democracy that made Nietzsche dangerous in the context of the Weimar Republic render Nietzsche dangerous again today. when far-right ideologues are on the rise and liberal democracy is on the defensive. This 21st century revival of the far right is exactly what Conor Cruz O'Brien anticipated when, in the third of his 1969 T.S. Eliot Memorial Lectures, published in his book Suspecting Glance, he expressed deep anxiety about what Nietzsche's messages might affect when they reached minds which were as bold in action as he was bold in thought. No one today can reasonably question that Nietzsche continues to inspire fascist vanguardists in the present. Consider a jaw-dropping text by Bronze Age pervert, this is November 2021, entitled Communitaire Fools, which is full of celebration of Nietzsche as a prophet of the contemporary far right. Nietzsche, the real Nietzsche, as opposed to the distorted Nietzsche invented and propagated by liberals after the completion of the Second World War, this Nietzsche was the leader and prophet of all genuinely new thought after 1900 and of all the right-wing European factions. And in the preface to Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, Alamariu's doctoral thesis, which he published last September, Bap/Alamariu writes that his basic project is an attempt to explain some of the implications of Nietzsche for a world in which he is still the only prophet and will remain so for some centuries. I wrote my Dangerous Minds book without knowing anything about Bap, Bronze Age pervert, but it's above all Bap and his hordes of fervent followers. I can discuss later just how many followers he has, who have vindicated the book's thesis that Nietzsche offers an alarmingly potent resource for a rising far right. It's surely not an accident that the major adherents of the radical right, whether in the context of Weimar Germany or in our contemporary context, consistently view Nietzsche as the originator of the modern radical right and as the prophet of their movement. This is stated by Bap as clearly as one could hope for. According to the narrative offered by Bap, from 1950, when Kaufmann published his Nietzsche, until around 2006, one had a safely domesticated and benign Nietzsche. What happened in 2005 is that the internet had come to fruition and disposed of the hegemonic liberal gatekeepers. This meant that it was possible to spread the truth that Nietzsche was right and that the liberal cultural elites were wrong. Right about what? That democracy, egalitarianism, and human rights are nonsense, lies enforced by the hegemonic liberals and leftists. Instead, what truly matters is civilizational grandeur. And civilizational grandeur is incompatible with democracy, egalitarianism, and human rights. The latter must be destroyed if human beings are to rise to their intended destiny. Goebbels once said that the Nazis would erase 1789 from history, which is more or less coincident with Nietzsche's project. In fact, it's a pretty brilliant encapsulation of that project. It may well be that Nietzschean vanguardists like Bap and Greg Johnson are symptoms rather than causes. Still, even as mere symptoms, the existence of such intellectual defenders of a renaissance of fascism is profoundly unsettling. In my view, the key question interpreting Nietzsche is whether there is a center to his thought. His aphoristic style and hyper-pluralistic rhetoric suggest not. But of course, Nietzsche might have adopted both the style and the rhetoric precisely in order to blur the issue of his having a center and what that center might be. It's relevant to note that in two letters to friends, a letter to Karl Fuchs dated December 14, 1887, and a letter to Paul Deussen dated January 3, 1888, Nietzsche explicitly declared his thinking to be governed by such a center. In both letters, he judged hostile critics ill-equipped to judge him, to pronounce him eccentric because they had no notion of what his center was. The great passion in the service in which I live, he said. If there is a center, what is that center? Well, it's not terribly difficult to answer this question, actually. After all, Nietzsche is uninhibitedly vocal about what his fundamental concerns are. And those fundamental concerns are far more political than his defenders typically claim them to be. One doesn't need to read between the lines. Jeff Waite, in his big book on Nietzsche, suggested that one needed to resort to an esotericist hermeneutics in order to penetrate Nietzsche's real game. I don't deny that there may be interesting esotericist dimensions to Nietzsche's writing, as is true of many great thinkers in the canon. But it's simply not true that there's anything hidden or veiled about his core message. In order to identify the epicenter of the Nietzschean universe, I want to focus on two defining metaphors that don't get as much attention from readers of Nietzsche as they deserve. First, the theme of the dwarfing of humanity. I was actually a bit astonished to read in Stephen's paper that Mill used exactly the same imagery, that was a kind of bit of a shock to me. And secondly, the theme of tensing the bow. I realize that those sympathetic to Nietzsche will cry cherry picking. To state the obvious, it's impossible to offer an interpretation without privileging particular texts. Both those critical of Nietzsche and those inclined to defend him will be doing their own selection of privileged texts. All one can do as an interpreter is select the text that strike one as capturing most faithfully what Nietzsche's intellectual and normative core really is, and hope that one's selection yields a more convincing fit with Nietzsche's overall corpus. I know of at least 4 places where Nietzsche deploys the trope of a dwarfed humanity under the sway of modernity. Probably there are others, but to save time, let me cite only 3 of them. First, the end of section 203 of Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche curses the overall degeneration of man, the diminution of man into the perfect herd animal, the animalization of man into the dwarf animal of equal rights and claims. Nietzsche expresses nothing but contempt for the cultural situation where precisely this turning of human beings into dwarfs is raised up as an egalitarian ideal. Second, near the end of section 11, Genealogy of Morals, first essay, where Nietzsche asks, who would not 100 times sooner fear the blonde beast as the core of all noble races than not fear, but be permanently condemned to the repellent sight of the ill-constituted, dwarfed, atrophied, and poisoned. Nietzsche goes on in the next paragraph to conjure up an image of the swarming of the maggot man, the hopelessly mediocre and insipid man who's already learned to feel himself as the goal and zenith, as the meaning of history. And here he's unmistakably anticipating Bronze Age perverts' depiction of liberal modernity in terms of what Almayer calls the bug man. Third, Will to Power, section 8866, which once again encapsulates the existing dispensation in terms of the dwarfing of mankind. The Übermensch, Nietzsche tells us, will initiate a counter-movement to this dwarfing and adaptation of man to a specialized utility, resulting in a higher form of aristocracy that will put an end to the universal leveling that currently prevails. Our dwarfed condition under the dispensation of bourgeois modernity is the problem, and the tensing of the bow is the solution. We are too soft, too pampered, to borrow Nietzsche's telling expression in Will to Power sections 868 and 922. We have to toughen up. We need, in the words of Genealogy, first essay, section 12, to stand forth unbreakable, tensed, ready for new, even harder and remoter things, like a bow that distress only serves to draw more taut. 3 times in Beyond Good and Evil, he invokes the image of the taut bow as a symbol of the very different dispensation for which he yearns. For instance, section 262 celebrates the hardness and intolerance of aristocratic morality, which had dammed up such enormous strength and bent the bow in such a threatening manner. But again, the rise of democracy ensured that this tension-generating morality came to be supplanted by insipid morality of mediocrity. Clearly, one can shoot for the most distant goals only if one can reverse the hegemony of democratic culture and reinstate a harsh aristocratic morality that doesn't hesitate to enforce its illiberal norms with rock-hard stringency. Finally, let's draw the attention that it deserves to section 961 of The Will to Power, where Nietzsche spells out with decisive clarity where he's going with this rhetoric. The all-important task is to see at which points in history great human beings arise. Herein consists the significance of protracted despotic moralities. They tense the bow, provided they do not break it. This is the Nietzschean normative vision in a nutshell. Nietzsche's central teaching is that culture thrives in societies whose denizens are taught to be fierce and heartless, which is why he views liberal culture under a perversely egalitarian dispensation as, strictly speaking, a non-culture. The central teaching in Nietzsche as a political philosopher is remarkably easy to sum up. Life is meaningful when the strong and the gifted dominate the weak and the mediocre. Christianity has wrecked Western civilization by delegitimizing, on the basis of its egalitarian morality, the truth of this view of life. The crisis in Western culture came to a head when liberalism and democracy brought to completion what was implicit in Christian morality: the equality of all, the moral superiority of the weak over the strong, thereby extinguishing ancient insights into what makes real culture possible. Insights briefly revived during the Renaissance and in the career of Napoleon. Culture and existential meaning will be reborn when Christianity and its modern offshoots have been destroyed. Any interpretation of Nietzsche that tries to evade or soft pedal the fact that this is the core of Nietzsche's philosophy immediately discredits itself. By this standard, a conception of Nietzsche's basic project held by someone like Franz H. Pervert is, I would say, 100 times more reliable than the versions of Nietzsche that are predominant in the universities today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Beiner. Our next speaker is Dr. Shilo Brooks, who, like our first speaker, is coming home. Shilo Brooks is Executive Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, where he also teaches in the Department of Politics. He was previously Associate Faculty Director of the Benson Center and Faculty Director of the Engineering Leadership Program at CU. He is also the author of Nietzsche's Culture War, a book on Nietzsche's work, The Untimely Meditations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shilo Brooks.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm going to take up half my time just thanking you, but it means a tremendous amount to me to be back at CU, especially at the Benson Center. This is a place that I love. It's a place that I defended when it was under siege. I'm proud to have done it, and we look on the Benson Center at the James Madison Program at Princeton, and we're impressed with what you do here, and I'm cheering you on. Your biggest fan are those of us at the James Madison Program at Princeton. We love what you do. So thank you, and thank you to everybody in this room who over the course of my career has given me words of wisdom and advice. It really does mean a lot to me to be back here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Nietzsche, what I call Nietzsche and the political problem. Let me just say just a quick word about how I came to Nietzsche. I was not raised, in an alt-right family or anything like that. I was raised in a family, Christian, conservative, patriotic people. And I found Nietzsche at a great books college, the one where Michael teaches, called St. John's, and I realized what it meant to have a liberal education, because what Nietzsche does and why Nietzsche has a place on college curricula, in my view, is that he challenges students to overturn or confront their convictions, their deepest held convictions, their religion, their attachment to the regime, liberalism in which they find themselves, and to submit those attachments to rational scrutiny to see if they hold water. And in that sense, Nietzsche frees the mind. You may not agree with him, you may finish reading him and not agree with him, you may finish reading him and agree with him, but what he's going to do is challenge you to think through your deepest held assumptions, and if you're not doing that in liberal education, then you're not doing it right. And so that's why I continue to return to Nietzsche, despite being a person who teaches on American statesmanship and these sorts of things, is that Nietzsche challenges me like no other author. So let me just say a word about what I'm going to call Nietzsche's political problem. Nietzsche has, as you've just heard, harsh views of liberalism. I would say this: his thoughts on liberalism are pretty untimely. they seem to strike our ears as very odd and offensive. But I think this is why they can enrich our own thoughts about it. In keeping with liberal education, we consult those things that challenge us. Nietzsche's so untimely, in fact, he's so remote from our contemporary political discourse that the political term liberal, right, and its ideological cognate liberalism appear pretty sparingly in his writings. He's more likely to speak of freedom than liberalism, and especially of the free-spirited, or you could translate that, the free-minded individual. So just as Nietzsche frees your mind when you read him, he's concerned with the free-minded individual. His books address free-minded individuals and the requirements for their formation. This is in part because he doesn't really think liberal institutions can form free-spirited or free-minded individuals. And when he speaks of liberal institutions, it's a lot of times to criticize them for suffocating freedom of the mind or freedom of spirit. He's got a book called Twilight of the Idols, which he says is my philosophy in a nutshell. It's the most compressed location of his philosophy. There's an aphorism there called My Conception of Freedom. And he says there, quote, liberal institutions cease to be liberal as soon as they are attained. Later on, there are no worse and no more thorough injurers of freedom than liberal institutions. Now, the reason that he thinks liberal institutions are illiberal, which we would all find somewhat appalling, I suspect, and injurious to freedom, is that liberal institutions demand unconditional conformity. Even though they're liberal, they demand unconditional conformity to liberal ideals of freedom and well-being. In the words of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, in a liberal society, everybody wants the same. Everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily to the madhouse. So you have this notion in liberalism that the standard of liberal happiness is that everybody's a bunch of duplicates, right? And sometimes I look out on my students and I wonder if that's not true. This is not to offend you, but you know, there's a certain truth to this claim. There's also, you know, some notion that one who deviates from the liberal standard of health, especially as it relates to the mind, has some mental health problem, right? That this is, of course, endemic in our time. I think Nietzsche would say that goes part and parcel with liberalism. It shows that nobody can be different, or else they're just thought to be mentally ill. So liberalism can't really tolerate spiritual difference or intellectual difference because it can't risk freedom of mind, Nietzsche would think, or freedom of spirit. There are certain free minds, certain free spirits who are very, very free. They're so free that they risk becoming free enough to dominate spiritually or mentally, intellectually, the less free. It's not clear from what these people have been liberated. These would be extraordinarily great human beings. And more importantly, it's not obvious such a free person to what they would be driven, what they might do. And liberalism can't tolerate that. These spirits are great spirits, Nietzsche would say. Their greatness consists, he says, in, quote, being noble, wanting to be by oneself, being able to be different, standing alone, and having to live independently. Nietzsche thinks liberalism is illiberal because it doesn't permit a freedom that derives its meaning from the distance between the average man or woman and the great man or woman. He says this of liberal institutions and what they do to the mind and the spirit. They, quote, level mountain and valley. And this is what they call morality, this flattening and evening out of all personalities and dispositions. They flatten the peaks of the human spirit, and they replace that spirit, he says, with people who are small, cowardly, and hedonistic. He calls liberalism herd animalization, and he says that a spirit who has become truly free would, quote, spit on liberalism and its contemptible type of well-being, the car, the investment bank, the happiness that's just even keeled, the binging on the Netflix, the not having a thought, the enjoying pleasure, and that being the good life. For Nietzsche, the free human being is not a herd animal. The free human being, he says, is a warrior. Freedom is cultivated through war, because freedom consists in overcoming spiritual adversaries. Freedom means, quote, that one has the will to assume responsibility for oneself, that one maintains the distance which separates us, that one becomes more indifferent to difficulties, hardships, privation, even to life itself, that one is prepared to sacrifice human beings for one's cause, not excluding oneself. So Nietzschean freedom, in contrast to the liberal idea of freedom, requires risk. It requires exertion, struggle, the discipline to achieve a liberation that comes from victory over adversaries, not making peace with them. The highest type of free men, he says, should be sought where the highest resistance is constantly overcome. 5 steps from tyranny, close to the threshold of the danger of servitude. Freedom for Nietzsche is action rather than contentment. It's vigor rather than pleasure. It's growth rather than sustainability. And it is war of the inside and the outside rather than peace. So we could say this, that Nietzsche's reputation for being a critic of the political left is well earned. But what makes him interesting to me is not simply that he's a profound critic of the left. It's that at the same time that he criticizes the left, he's also a profound critic of the political right. He disparages Bismarck and Bismarck's brand of conservatism for transforming Germany into a hyper-politicized nation, a nationalist nation without culture or spirit. He says, quote, "The Germans are now bored with the spirit, or bored with the mind. The Germans now mistrust the spirit. Politics swallows up all serious concern for really spiritual matters." In Twilight of the Idols, he warns conservatives. He says, quote, "A reversion, conservation, a return in any sense or degree is not possible." Conservative parties, politicians, Nietzsche calls these people crabs. It's a kind of metaphor because they walk backward. They think backward because they hope modern progress can be reversed. Blinded by nostalgia and antiquarianism, these conservative crabs underestimate the depth of modern corruption. Quote, "One must go forward," he says, "step by step into decadence. That is my definition of modern progress." We could say this about Nietzsche, that he thought modernity must collapse under its own weight before a new day could dawn. So his criticisms of the left and right, I would say, open up a political chasm. And they pose a real political quandary because they condemn the West's 2 major political alternatives, seemingly without offering a third way. It's with good reason that Nietzsche calls himself the last anti-political German in his autobiography. And yet, I think Nietzsche knew well that being anti-political, criticizing the left and right, that's not the same as being unpolitical. He does engage in political activity precisely because his anti-politics aim to liberate great individuals and their spirits and their minds from the degradation of the political. Freeing oneself from the political is itself a political act. To begin to see the political meaning of Nietzsche, and thus to consider whether he does offer a third way, one need only examine the character of the new nobility, these new great people he describes in various forms in a lot of his writings, but perhaps most overtly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his great poem, and Beyond Good and Evil, perhaps his greatest philosophic work. His Zarathustra gives a speech, and it's called On Old and New Tablets. And in that speech, he announces the need for a new nobility of some kind. And I'm arguing that this somehow gestures in the direction of a third way that's neither the left nor the right. And he says, quote, "A new nobility is needed to be the adversary of all rabble and of all that is despotic." Now, he seems to mean that great individuals are needed to be the adversaries of the dictatorial right and also the democratic left. These adversaries are adversaries of the political as such. Their nobility consists in the fact that they stand above or outside somehow the political. Nietzsche seems to want to bring this class into being. Their purpose is not to rule, but to prepare the way for superior individuals, an advancement or enhancement of the human race, people who are even nobler and freer than they are. Zarathustra says that their preparations don't require serving a prince, because these new nobles are, quote, exiles from all father and forefather lands. Again, it's anti-political, and yet it's somehow political. And Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche restates this call for a new nobility to arise when he describes, quote, individuals from such a noble lineage as are inclined by their high spirituality towards a more withdrawn and contemplative life, a life in which we might say they could avoid what Nietzsche calls the necessary dirt of all politics. So Nietzsche's criticisms of the left and the right, his anti-political rhetoric, his declaration famously of the death of God, his liberation of higher individuals, his veneration of the blonde beast, his allusions to the extermination of the lower types, this creates a really explosive political combination. It is this explosive political combination that opens up or seems to open up some kind of third political way. And we could call that third political way a radicalism of the right that took hold in Germany in the 1930s. You could say that the theoretical core of this radicalism, this radical right, it retains the old right's notion of order, right? But it jettisons the theism, the traditionalism of the old right, and replaces those with an atheism, with a kind of creative individualism and a destructive criticism of all that came before. Nietzsche's political problem was that he announces and tries to bring into being and articulates a theory of this new nobility, but he doesn't address the political practice by which they would emerge. There's no image of a regime in Nietzsche's philosophy, at least not of any substance. There's no discussion of constitutions and their nature. There's no elaboration of laws and policies and extensive discourse on rights. Nietzsche refused to provide these things, and his refusal to provide this practical political instruction, which is so characteristic of so many political philosophers, liberated his political progeny to do whatever they pleased in his name. His silence about politics was their license to forge a third way. Now, his refusal to address the means by which his new nobility would come into being, and thus his refusal to offer any explicitly political solution to his political problem, which is that he criticizes right and left and seems to offer us no alternative. Well, this seems to have been deliberate on his part. It was a deliberate refusal to say anything rather than out of ignorance or something like that. For Nietzsche, the problem of modern decadence, which for him means the problem of the last man, the most satisfied, complacent man, if you've seen Wall-E, the person who sits in their chair and sips high C and just binges movies with no ambition and no vigor. This was such a profound problem of such profound spiritual depth that political institutions, right, getting your guy elected or getting your party in power, that's powerless to address a problem so profound. A problem whose root cause is the death of God. You're not going to solve that at a think tank. You're not going to find public policy that's going to make that better. You're not going to reform your institutions to solve that problem. So such a problem requires, I think in Nietzsche's view, millennia-long cultural and religious solutions that are, by their nature, very vague and indefinite. Nietzsche also thought that the liberalization of the West had made it such that institutions could really no longer shape the future of man. They could no longer shape our societies because institutions, whether they're the church, whether it's marriage, whether it's the regime in some ways, they exert a kind of authority at which liberals balk, and they come to balk. They come to want to throw off the yoke. He says in Twilight of the Idols that, quote, "The whole of the West no longer possesses the instincts out of which institutions grow, out of which a future grows. Perhaps nothing antagonizes its modern spirit so much. Today one lives for the day. One lives very fast. One lives very irresponsibly. And it's precisely this that's called freedom. That which makes an institution is despised, hated, repudiated. One fears the danger of a new slavery the moment the word authority is spoken out loud. And insofar as institutions are required to exert authority, Nietzsche seems to think that won't do at all to solve this deep spiritual problem. So let me conclude with the following observation, which I hope will be worthy of discussion during our question and answer period. I've tried to show that one can reasonably accuse Nietzsche of rhetorical immoderation and gross political negligence in his criticisms of Western politics, left and right. For that reason, you could reasonably say that Nietzsche bears some responsibility for the horrors of the 1930s in Germany. But I've also tried to show that Nietzsche thinks spiritual circumstances are so bad in the West that the West is not redeemable. The threats posed by the death of God and the last man are existential in Nietzsche's judgment. If he's right about the gravity of these threats, then one could reasonably argue that rhetorical moderation and Conventional political solutions won't do. Extraordinary threats require extraordinary responses, whose extraordinary character is due in part to the risks and dangers they assume with their eyes open. It is immoderate to be reckless in the face of ordinary threats, but it is reckless to be moderate in the face of extraordinary ones. Was Nietzsche wrong, immoderate, and morally reckless? Or was he right, moderate, and perhaps even somehow morally dutiful? Settling the question of Nietzsche's political responsibility requires accurately addressing the spiritual circumstances in which he conceived his philosophy and to which he was responding. These circumstances are in many ways our present circumstances, because the question of the collapse of Western liberalism is among the most urgent questions of our time. Whichever way liberalism's legacy goes, so goes inversely the legacy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilo. Our last speaker is Dr. Michael Grenke. He's tutor at St. John's College. Tutor is the term that St. John's uses instead of professor, which is a charming thing, but it means every time you introduce somebody from there, you have to explain this. Dr. Grenke is a scholar of Nietzsche's thought. He is a translator of 2 works by Nietzsche, his prefaces to unwritten works, and is on the future of our educational institutions. He's also the world's leading expert on Euclid's optics, simply by virtue of being the only one. He wanted me to give his, best deadlift and everything like that, but I won't go into that. I think it was 700 pounds. Anyways, please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Grenke.
I want to say I agree with, in 2 ways perhaps, with the previous speakers. I'm grateful to be here, and I was not raised by an alt-right family. That may have just been an accident of the time, but in any case, I'm going to say something, I think, a little different. I'm going to just offer a reading of a short part of Nietzsche's most important book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that sketches an idea of freedom that Nietzsche's trying to invite us to consider. And it's a kind of idea of freedom that I think is relevant if you want to compare it to the kind of freedom that liberal politics might offer you. So here it is. To me, butterflies and soap bubbles and what is of their kind among human beings seem to know the most about happiness. These are the words of Friedrich Nietzsche through his character Zarathustra. I propose here, in the brief presentation, allowed us to make an attempt at an interpretation of the episode of Thus Spoke Zarathustra called On Reading and Writing, in which those words occur. The episode begins with Zarathustra's announcement that of all the things written, I love only that which one writes with his own blood. Zarathustra is proclaiming love only for a certain kind of writing, a writing that comes from what is the writer's own. What is one's own? 3 episodes earlier in the book, in an episode entitled On the Despisers of the Body, the self is identified with the body. Moreover, Zarathustra says, body am I entirely. Now, in light of that kind of claim, especially since we are beings that seem to think, for instance, we might have to rethink what body is if we're to understand this. Now, if I limit myself to the most immediately relevant part of this thought, then I suggest we understand writing with one's own blood to be putting into written form what most distinctively makes us what we are. Next, after this claim, Zarathustra says, write with blood, and you will experience that blood is spirit, or mind. It's the German word Geist. This apparently has to be said, because the listeners would tend not to think that blood or body is mind. But this is exactly Zarathustra's teaching and on the despisers of the body. The teaching is twofold. Quote, the body is a great reason, and the mind is, quote, a little reason. As personal and distinctive as our own body is, Zarathustra next says, it is not easily possible to understand strange blood. The suggestion is that we are not as different from one another, even in the private differentia of our own bodies, so that it is impossible for one human being to understand another. It's just not easy. It is because the understanding of strange blood is not easy that Zarathustra next announces that he hates reading idlers. Zarathustra is pointing to the world that concerns us, the world of love and hate, or love and hatred. Next, Zarathustra says, whoever is familiar with the reader will do nothing any longer for the reader. One might find it strange to suggest that a writer not have any consideration for his audience. What is writing for? Could we consider that there might be a kind of writing that is for the writer, maybe even wholly for the writer? The next three sentences suggest that Zarathustra thinks writing must be of a common sort in order to serve the common readers. By common, I do not necessarily mean base or low here, rather merely belonging to the more broadly shareable realm wherein our own most differentia, what makes us who we are, do not and cannot play a part. In the Nietzschean context, it is likely correct to associate this common realm with society, language, and conscious thought. This is the realm of the little reason spoken of before. From this specter of common reading and writing, Zarathustra returns to writing with blood, only this time he associates it with writing in aphorisms. Quote, whoever writes in blood and aphorisms wants not to be read, rather to be learnt by heart. Learning by heart is distinguished from being read. Might mean here, I think, being incorporated into the great reason that is the body. Further, Zarathustra associates aphorisms with mountain peaks that require long legs for getting from peak to peak. Thus, aphorisms resemble the kind of thinking that Zarathustra attributes to the great reason of the body. The body as the great reason. One might think here of reason as a ratio that determines relationships. The body sets the relationships that determine a living being's goals. The mind, the little conscious reason, then calculates the means to fulfill the goals. The great reason says, feel pain here. And the little reason then thinks how it might suffice, or how it might suffer no more. The great reason says, feel pleasure here. And the little reason then thinks how it might often be pleased again. The relationships and their consequent goals are like the peaks. And this similarity suggests a possible connection between the body and aphoristic thinking. Some new things then enter into the thinking here with the image of mountain peaks. Height, danger, rarity, and joyful wickedness. Zarathustra says these things go well together. Now, the combination of danger and joyfulness might seem unlikely, but they actually go well together in those who have courage. It is then unsurprising that Zarathustra returns to the topic of courage next. What is surprising is that he says this, I want kobolds around me, because I am courageous. Courage, which scares ghosts away, itself creates kobolds. Courage wants to laugh. Now, ghosts here may represent frightening things imposed from without, and this may even include mortality. Courage drives those external impositions away. But courage creates for itself its own, perhaps mischievous, household spirits, like kobolds. It wants to laugh. The images of being at a height continue, and perhaps in this episode the height is increasing. But does this height bring danger with it? Zarathustra proclaims that he feels differently from his listeners. He sees a cloud beneath him. His listeners experience this cloud as a weather cloud. For them, beneath the cloud, it brings weather, and therefore it brings darkness and heaviness. Above a cloud, there is no weather. From his height, Zarathustra laughs at the darkness and heaviness. What brings this freedom from the oppressive effects of the external environment? Zarathustra says, you look up when you long after elevation, and I look down because I am elevated. Elevation is an image that surely needs an interpretation here. But even such an interpretation by itself would not be enough to get at what Zarathustra is talking about. For Zarathustra immediately asks, who among you can at the same time laugh and be elevated? With this question about laughter, it is evident that danger is involved in the idea of elevation. The difficulty that elevation brings with it is its tendency to impose seriousness. High things cannot be laughed at. Seriousness here is gravity. It is the fear of falling. When one is up high, when one has little ground for footing, tragedy looms. And to this, Zarathustra responds, whoever climbs the highest mountains laughs at all tragic plays and tragic seriousness. If one should remain in doubt as to whether elevation and laughter can be combined, Zarathustra points to the image of the warrior. He says this, quote, courageous, unconcerned, mocking, violent, thus wisdom wants us. She is a woman and loves ever only a warrior. Warriors show that danger and laughter can be put together. They are a kind of model, and perhaps something of the warrior spirit can never be left behind. Now, I will not try to say much about the next turn in Zarathustra's speech. It talks about bearing burdens. But I'll skip to what he says after the burden-bearing part. What he says next is perhaps, I think, an even fuller response to the question that really makes Zarathustra talk about bearing burdens. It's the claim that many people make that life is hard, or as expressed explicitly in that text, life is heavy to carry. What Zarathustra says next is this, quote, it is true we love life, not because we are accustomed to living, rather because we are accustomed to loving. We do not wish to avoid action and its effort. Being active, doing things, and loving is such a doing, is what makes us wish to live. This suggests that we love life not because we need it, that is not because of some lack we experience that could be filled by something other than ourselves. Rather, we love life because it allows us to express in action the fullness within ourselves. In raising the possibility that human beings can do things out of fullness, Nietzsche is challenging a long tradition of philosophy and philosophical psychology that understands need or deficiency as the only motive for human action. Why would a human being do something, they say, that is, make a change, if the present situation were not in some way lacking? This tradition thus understands the fulfilling of human needs as the only motive, and it proceeds to define human nature in terms of needs and their fulfilling. Nietzsche presents this way of thinking as itself defective. It understands the human being as not having anything to do if its needs were all fulfilled. This is to understand life itself as a kind of deficient condition, as a kind of sickness. The sick conceive of health as merely the absence of illness. But Nietzsche asks us to consider that such a negative definition of health and of human nature sells short the human possibilities. What, he asks, would the sick person want if they should be freed of their illness? What would each of us do if no external needs were imposed on us? This brings us to flight. Zarathustra announces, because he is well disposed toward life, that to him, quote again, butterflies and soap bubbles, and whatever is of their kind among human beings, seem to know the most about happiness. One might wonder what there is among human beings that is of the kind of butterflies and soap bubbles. One clue might be in what Zarathustra says about the way they fly. They flutter. Of all the things that fly, why choose butterflies and soap bubbles as the examples? Their transience is likely part of it. They're delicate and do not last, but apparently this does not prevent or diminish their happiness. Also, their fluttering presents an image of flight that is not full of effort or struggle. Is the image one of being subjected to the winds, driven about whether willing or unwilling? I think the sequel suggests that is not the case. In the antepenultimate verse of the episode, Zarathustra says, quote, I have learned to walk. Since then, I let myself run. I have learned to fly. Since then, I do not want to be pushed into leaving a place. This flying that Zarathustra has learned is a kind of freedom that expresses only the positive motives of the living being. This free flyer moves when he wants to move, because of what he is. Learning flying is becoming what one is. The flyer is free to assume whatever height he wants or wishes. He can be above the weather or subject to the weather as he wishes. This freedom is the real height. Even the mountain peaks and their danger fall away beneath the flyer's feet. And if there is danger, it is there because courage wants it. In between the soap bubbles and this free flight that is based upon nothing but the will, Zarathustra introduces his God and his devil. His God dances, and his devil is the spirit of gravity. Zarathustra says of the spirit of gravity that it is by means of him that all things fall. Why do all things fall? It is because all of them are understood to have an intrinsic weight, an importance of their own, independent of human beings. This doctrine, that all things fall, would make a free flying impossible. Such a doctrine would turn all flying into a struggle against motive forces that come from outside of the flyer. All flying would become falling. After introducing the spirit of gravity, Zarathustra says, not by means of anger, rather by means of laughter does one kill. Get up, let us kill the spirit of gravity. How does laughter kill? It depotenizes the thing laughed at. It denies that a thing has an intrinsic importance of its own, that it can impose upon the human being. Is there anything that cannot be laughed at? At the end of the episode, Zarathustra says, now I see myself beneath myself. If laughter can kill the spirit of gravity, then not everything falls. Then the freedom of flight is possible. This freedom is a doing in accord with what is most one's own. It is a living in a way that makes us want to be alive. It needs to be learned, perhaps by writing in blood, but perhaps also by making the effort to read in such a way that one can come to understand strange blood. It requires rethinking thinking and its relation to the body. Courage and its laughter are needed. There are perhaps dangers here, but there are also dangers in living in a way that is not worthwhile. Thank you.
Now that I know butterflies and soap bubbles are the keys to happiness, you can get my 3-year-old daughter a copy of Zarathustra. We're going to begin the question and answer period, and I think we're going to generate some conversation and kick it to you guys if you have any questions. So, Paul, take us away.
Is this working? Yeah, okay. So this first question is to Stephen and Ronnie. Stephen, in your paper, you suggest that Nietzsche not only helps us understand the conditions for the generation of genius, but that his work also contributes generatively to the dynamism that is productive of culture and genius. But how would you respond to, Ronnie's concerns, his keenly articulated concerns that Nietzsche is too dangerous to be generative, right? He's too destabilizing of the conditions for generative culture, at least in liberalism.
This is working? Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, the short answer is I just don't think that's true. The longer answers, and I think actually Shilo mentioned this about liberal education, that we have to be able to face uncomfortable ideas, uncomfortable thoughts, and I think especially if you live in a liberal age, which we all do, and we do take much of it for granted, to confront an anti-liberal thinker is just generally good. I mean, part of the danger question, well, I'd like to answer to these, I'll try not to go too long, but part of the danger question too is the responsibility question, which is how much is Nietzsche responsible for fascism, for Nazism? And I'm of the opinion that yes, great thinkers, especially very influential ones who are very rhetorically powerful and good writers, do make for the conditions that might lead to that. But there's many other things too. I think that we shouldn't overestimate how much one thinker can do. The hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, right? The collective guilt that was placed on the German people in the Versailles Treaty. Mussolini's fascist movement in Italy. And then I think even more so than that on the Nietzsche side, the role of Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, who is Nietzsche's sister, whose husband was this very, very high-ranking Nazi official, and that she used Nietzsche's unpublished works, which turned into the book The Will to Power, in order to give a rationale for the Nazi movement. I'm not trying to say Nietzsche's not culpable at all, but I think we need to keep all those sorts of things in mind. The other thing about the danger, and Ronnie did say this, which I appreciated in his talk, but I want to read a quote. It says, and if you remember, Ron points to the dwarfing of humanity in a liberal democratic age. This is a quote: "What are really the intellectual characteristics of this liberal age? Is it true that our mental light, let us account for the fact as we may, has not lost in intensity, at least a part of what it has gained in diffusion," right, the spreading of enlightenment. "Whether our march of intellect be not rather a march towards doing without intellect, and supplying our deficiency of giants by the unified efforts of a constantly increasing multitude of dwarfs." And that's John Stuart Mill. And you could find plenty more quotes like that from Mill, and more, I would even say, from Alexis de Tocqueville, both thinkers that wanted to promote liberalism but recognized its limitations, right? So, and I guess one question you could ask, well, then why not just use them, and why use Nietzsche, if Nietzsche is somehow more dangerous? Well, I mean, number one, I think Nietzsche's just a better writer. He's more interesting in a lot of ways. He clearly appeals to people more. One of the reasons why the alt-right and some of these thinkers that maybe on the right, how precisely to label them, but people like the Bronze Age pervert or Richard Spencer, they're obviously drawn to these ideas because they feel something lacking in their liberal experience, shall we say. And so we have to understand why. We have to understand Nietzsche better. And frankly, I don't think these thinkers give a proper account of Nietzsche. You can find that stuff in Nietzsche, the stuff that, and I'm not sure I'm even speaking. Can I just ask, how many people know or have read The Bronze Age Pervert? Woo! Okay, so a few. But I mean, this is happening for a reason, so we should try to understand Nietzsche better. I will say for the supporters of Bronze Age Pervert, Nietzsche didn't lift weights though, right? The masculinity thing, right? There's a lot there that's being added. And long story short, I think that we need to also re-engage with Nietzsche and understand him better, precisely because there are these interpretations of Nietzsche today, primarily amongst the youth, and understand that whole situation better.
Great. I want to give Ronnie a chance to reply.
Yeah, it's going to be hard for me to make my case in just a few minutes. First, let me say there's no proposal by me to expel Nietzsche from the canon. He belongs in the canon. The purpose of political philosophy is to make us more self-critical, and as liberals, we need illiberal thinkers to re-examine our liberal assumptions, so Nietzsche certainly does that. And for much of my career, I was a kind of left Nietzschean because I saw Nietzsche as a very potent, source of potent cultural critique of liberalism, and liberalism needs that to be self-reflective. But I think that we've moved into a different zeitgeist that for this, and this is the main thing I would want to say, that for, 70 years after 1945, we could say, well, as liberals, let's see what we can learn from this very illiberal thinker. And we had the luxury of not worrying about how he might influence the radical right. And we no longer have that luxury. And we have to take very seriously Nietzsche's influence. It's no joke that he's helping to inspire and motivate someone like Alamariu. And this represents something that's very dangerous for liberal democracy. And, so I had a bit of a Twitter war last September when Alamariu published Selective Breeding. And I put out some posts thinking they would be seen by maybe 100 people or so. And it got picked up by the Bapites. We certainly have one in this room. And so if you add together the tweets that went viral, it was in excess of 3 million views, or maybe closer to 4 million. Just one of my tweets got 1.9 million views. And these were not my followers, these were BAP's followers. And BAP is someone who, what he gets out of Nietzsche is a project to celebrate military dictatorship for the purpose of a eugenic breeding of perfect specimens. That is a Nazi project. That's not to say Nietzsche was Nazi, but this is BAP's Nietzscheanism. And he was being supported by some very powerful figures in contemporary politics, like Christopher Rufo, who didn't bother him that this was, someone who says that openly that his politics is fascist or worse, where or worse means Nazi. So this is telling us something very disturbing about our political culture. We have to take this very seriously. This is no joke. I admit to being obsessed by the radical right for the last 9 years. It's an unhealthy obsession, but I think it's an obsession rooted in the disturbing ways in which our political culture is changing. I could go on much longer, but
All right, I want to focus a bit on the core argument in a way of Nietzsche. And I thought Ronnie and Shilo, you articulated this argument probably more clearly than anybody else. I'll quote you first, Ronnie, and then Shilo, and I'll kick it to you, Shilo, to discuss this. Ron, you say what truly matters is civilizational grandeur. It's maybe the major premise.
Yeah.
And the minor premise, civilizational grandeur is incompatible with democracy, egalitarianism, and human rights. Shilo, you put it like this. Nietzsche thinks spiritual circumstances are so bad in the West that the West is not redeemable. The threats posed by the death of God and the last man are existential in Nietzsche's judgment. If Nietzsche is right about the gravity of these threats, then one could reasonably argue that rhetorical moderation and conventional political solutions will not do. So you both state the argument, but don't really go into the degree to which you agree with it or what you take issue with it, specifically the core arguments. So I wanted to just push you both to sort of articulate a little bit. Do you see a flaw in this argument as you articulated? And if so, what is it? And if not, where does that leave us?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so you want to know if I see, if I agree with Nietzsche that the threat of the last man and the death of God are existential.
Yeah, that it requires political moderation.
Yeah. You know, I guess part of the beauty of my study of Nietzsche is I contain in my own soul attention. As I mentioned a moment ago, I'm a person who is attached to the American regime in a very intense way, but who is compelled by the arguments that Nietzsche makes. And so I would say this, I say if because I don't know if. I don't know if. I think that there are, by way of Tocqueville, the grandeur of the American founders, the dignity and height of men like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, it's not wholly right to say that liberalism doesn't produce extraordinary human beings. Or at least I'm not persuaded that a man like Lincoln and Washington, who were generated by this regime, are not themselves geniuses of the kind that were mentioned in Stephen's paper. So I say if because I'm genuinely perplexed by it. On the other hand, I will say that what I see around me today, you know, makes Nietzsche's case more alive than I think it's ever been. And I'll say this about my students: they understand Nietzsche when we read him more immediately than they might have 10 years ago. They have an access to the spiritual circumstances he describes, the decay of liberalism, which I would say some years ago I had to work, and I can only imagine 30 or 40 years ago, I had to work to illustrate. Today, those circumstances are immediate. And so that vindicates Nietzsche in a certain way. But I just conclude by saying much of my own intellectual life, and I recommend this to anyone who loves ideas, is animated by the profound disagreement between these two sides.
Yeah, I think my answer to the question is much clearer and less conflicted. I mean, the civilizational politics which Nietzsche yearns for is absolutely terrifying. And that is the core of his critique of liberalism. That doesn't give us civilizational politics. And fascism did promise to give us what Nietzsche wanted. It was civilization. You know, Mussolini wanted to bring back the Roman Empire. Hitler aspired to a 1,000-year Reich. They were wanting to give exactly what Nietzsche said was lacking in liberalism, and the whole purpose of his politics is to stoke up these kinds of desires. So we really, I think, have to take very seriously the ways in which Nietzsche fed into, you know, the fascism of the 20s and 30s, and worry about it coming back. So, you know, there's a definite political project in Nietzsche. There's a negative side, which is to destroy, you know, 1789. I think Goebbels put it very well that the project is to erase 1789 from history, and that is a Nietzschean project. And you know, Nietzsche's not just after a regime change, he's after change of dispensation. We live in a dispensation shaped by 1789 with ideas of equal human dignity and equal citizenship, and Nietzsche thinks all that's worthless because produces leveling that makes it impossible for us to aspire to things that are civilizational. And the positive project is to re-legitimize hierarchy and even caste. And so he may not, there's no policy prescriptions, but there's definitely a political project, and fascism was definitely a version of, trying to speak to those yearnings. I mean, I don't think it's adequate, or it doesn't let him off the hook to say, well, he wasn't a fascist. Well, of course he wasn't a fascist. Fascism didn't exist in the 1880s. But he was a proto-fascist. That's what he was. You could say, well, he would not have become a Nazi in 1933. Well, it's the same story as with the figures of the conservative revolution in the 20s. None of them joined the Nazi party because it was too plebeian. It was too, it wasn't aristocratic enough for their taste. And if Nietzsche was alive in 1933, his reaction would have been the same. But they stoked up, to say, well, it's not aristocratic. Well, of course it's not. They had these grand ideas of what was going to be. And then when, it actually appeared in front of them, then they turned their nose up at it. I just like the parallel to relationship between Marx and Stalin. Marx had all kinds of wonderful ideas. But, if it's actually put into practice, it's going to look very different from this grand theorizing. So, very easy for Nietzsche to say, well, we'll have a new aristocracy. And then, well, the new, a movement arises saying, okay, we are the new aristocracy. Of course, Nietzsche said, well, that's not good enough, none of that lets him off the hook. And it's telling that, Hitler saw Nietzsche as the genius who defined his movement. For him, Nietzsche and Hitler were the two geniuses that were to found a new civilization. That's why he went to the Nietzsche archives and had a state photographer photograph him looking, contemplating a bust of Nietzsche, because they were, Nietzsche was for his regime exactly what Marx was for Stalin's regime. We need to be very disturbed by all of that, I think. Yeah.
I just want to make a quick comment, and two things. I'll just skip the one. But I just wanted to say, and this is something that I think gets in the weeds of Nietzsche scholarship that probably no one in this room really wants to hear about. But I do want to respond to this thing. He definitely has a political project, Nietzsche's political project. Why we say that, maybe there's a reason for that, because we have a lot of political theorists up here. But he did not have a political project in a formal sense. He was mostly concerned with culture. Now, the link between culture and politics is very real. I'm not saying that, that the warning isn't real, or that you can find calls for a return to aristocracy in Nietzsche. Of course you can find that. But he was still mostly concerned with culture and cultural change. Most of the geniuses and great figures he talks about are cultural figures. And also there's a shift that pretty much all Nietzsche scholars agree to between his early and middle periods and his later period. In his later periods, he does get a lot more vociferous in his calls for maybe major political change, much more immoderate. But it's not his whole corpus. So again, I know that's a little bit of a boring answer, but I think it's worth saying. There's no definite political project in Nietzsche.
Is destroying liberalism, democracy, and egalitarianism not a political project? How could it be anything other than a political project? To destroy 1789.
Michael,
sorry.
So I'm inclined to say Ronnie's wrong about how easy it is to identify the core of Nietzsche. And I think you might notice a vast literature that says many different things from many people who put a lot of work in on this. And that's just some indication of how difficult it is. But I want to say it's precisely wrong, and I'll just cite a couple things. And maybe I should say you shouldn't cite The Will to Power. It's not a book. Nietzsche didn't write it. It's highly adulterated. Fully a third of the sections have been edited by someone who isn't Nietzsche. They've been cut or spliced together. One of them was copied out of the newspaper by Nietzsche. And basically, when you're reading Nietzsche's notes, which might be very interesting and helpful and provocative, you're not reading what he thought. You're reading what he thought about. And you don't know what he thought about what he wrote in his notebooks. So I just think you shouldn't use that as a guide to what he thought. Not at all.
Isn't your third Nietzsche book taken from the notebooks?
Yeah, and I think one can read them and learn from them. As I think, by the way, I think one should try to learn from philosophers. But the thing I want to point to is, if you go to 126 in Beyond Good and Evil, he says, a people is a detour of nature to get 6 or 7 great individuals, and then to get around them. That is, he's not aiming at a regime that will replace liberal democracy, except as a stage in an ongoing sort of recycling of regimes, each of which contributes something specific and different to the human condition. I think his main opposition to liberal democracy, despite some distaste for it, is a fear that it would last forever. And that's the thing that I think you need to face is, are you defending the last man? It wouldn't be unusual to do so. That's exactly what happens in the episode in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He gives a speech about a reduced, diminished human life, which is meant to repulse the audience because Zarathustra assumes they have some pride. But they instead interrupt him and ask to be made into these people. Is that what you're defending? Because I think Nietzsche is looking at democracy as something that's had a long turn, and a particularly starting maybe even from the Socratic elevation of reason, a singular development that's dominated the Western condition and that has had a turn. And I'll point to one more thing. It's not right, I think, exactly to say that he thinks the liberal democratic condition can't produce greatness. If you look at section 200, he describes exactly a cosmopolitan community. He calls it a late culture, so it is some kind of degeneration from aristocracy, in which all sorts of different kinds of human beings mix together. And he says the most extraordinary growths emerge from that. More extraordinary than the growths that emerge from the aristocracies, which fix a type. These wild growths are, I think, more like what was described as genius. And that's what he says comes really out of, I think, the democratic cosmopolitan community. And maybe if you go to 61, which Shilo quoted from, section 61 of Beyond Good and Evil, in the middle of that, Nietzsche praises the Christian priests for keeping a whole host of human beings interested in life and alive. He doesn't suggest they should be done away with. In fact, he says right there, the philosophic ruler type should be cultivating those conditions and possibly replacing the Christianity in them. That's all.
Let's get to the last.
So, Michael, if people knew Nietzsche by your presentation, I don't think that Dr. Beiner would be as worried. Can you tell us a little bit about how it is that the worrisome Nietzsche, the teaching on the warrior spirit, fits together with the teaching on flight?
Okay. I just tried to show some of the difficulty that actually exists in trying to read Nietzsche and understand what he's saying. And I think you could see from the moments I quote things, there's not an easy and clear way to accept what I suggested they meant. That is, it's not so obvious, it's not so easy to do this and to weave them together. And so I think reading that just shows the kind of difficulty of seeing what he's talking about. But the danger that was combined with laughter, maybe is, I think that's the locus where you might look at it and say, this is a dangerous thinker. I'm going to say this simply. I mean, Nietzsche is a powerful thinker. That power is itself dangerous. It's disruptive. He's a thinker who provides, I think in the world at the time he provided it, and maybe still, new things that people haven't appreciated as new yet. And the new is disruptive of the existing order, necessarily. Can it be made compatible with the existing order? Is there a gentle Nietzsche that is the true Nietzsche? I wouldn't say that, and I don't think Nietzsche would. Nietzsche says many hard things, but I'll just mention one. he looks forward, I think, to a coming age in which maybe every one of us will have to carry a gun. He looks forward to something that makes us less settled and less comfortable in our lives. And what Ronnie's pointing to is very serious. I mean, America is a fortress that hasn't been disrupted in this way for a long time now. It's a long-lived nation already. Many nations in the world do not live that long. And if you're a human being who lives longer than your nation, I think you're going to go through tremendous hardships. And if you have to go through civil wars and things like that, or even just fear terrorist acts, which there's plenty of violence in the United States, that you might feel, that's a hard burden. On the other hand, there's a kind of living death that looms in Nietzsche's vision that he fears might settle in. And he wants, I think, regime change again and again. That's what 126 means. Reach these heights. It might be a culture, a civilizational grandeur, as you say, but he's not isolating it to the presence of one civilization. And so, maybe the last thing I'd say is human experimentation is frightening. I think Nietzsche understands our lives necessarily, both in our institutional lives, our social lives, and our private lives, to be experimental. We can't avoid it. And I think the concern would be whether Nietzsche can offer any kind of help with that experimentation, or whether he tends to provoke experimentation that is damaging to us.
All right, thank you. I'm going to open up to the audience. I'll come out with the microphone.
I guess my question is really about how he foresaw this spread of this resentment actually becoming even more toxic as it cut loose of its Christian kind of origins. My sense is that if there was a single thing that I've been really astonished by over the last 10 or 20 years, is just how profound his insight was of how that resentment gets weaponized in a liberal culture, and how it's come to now to the point where in vast sections of Western civilization, to dissent is literally to risk criminal and other penalties. I mean, if Bronze Age pervert were in Canada, he'd be in jail, I have no doubt. And we're beginning to see that even here. So I guess the thing that I'm amazed by is that, am I right that he actually seemed to diagnose that whatever this may have originated, this slave mentality or resentment, this passion for absolute leveling equality in Christianity, that it actually, even Nietzsche seemed to foresee that secularization of it after the Protestant Reformation was going to make it even more powerful and unleash it in a sense that maybe it hadn't been in a Christian society.
Yes, I would. Yeah? Okay.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think the story that Nietzsche tells mainly on the genealogy of morals, although it's there in Beyond Good and Evil, just not sort of spread out and articulated in its fullness, is that, unfortunately, the Western civilization that we live in is the product of frustrated human beings who weren't afforded the proper opportunities to let out and express themselves in life, especially they had no chance to confront their enemies or their rivals and defeat them in battle, and that they were driven into themselves psychologically in a way that would make sure, I think, that they would develop exaggerated responses and exaggerated feelings because of frustration and prolongs repression. And I think Nietzsche's telling the story that this is there at the beginning of the biblical foundations of Western civilization, but it's also there in the Greeks, in the turn to reason, the turn away from passion in some ways. And so there's just great sources that I think he sees at the very beginning of Western civilization that would lead to these sorts of things. I'm trying to address his precedents in the sense. He sees a powerful rubric by which human beings not allowed to live freely and to express themselves because they had oppressors, were damaged and traumatized and developed a different kind of psychic interior, and that has persisted.
Yeah, I would love to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything Michael just said. I just wanted to add as well that, so in genealogy of morals is where this is really drawn out. But this slave morality that's resentful to the master. On the one hand, it just looks bad, right? It just looks like something that we should avoid, look down upon, whatever. But as in many of Nietzsche's lessons, there's always something at the end that teaches you a little bit more. So I'll try to be brief with it, but the Romans were just simply stronger, more vigorous, healthier than the Israelites and the Jews. And the Jews were forced to spiritualize, to use intellectual and psychological warfare in a sense, to try to reinterpret who the Romans were and who they were, right? And so on one hand, it's like this is the weak against the strong. And you might think, well, Nietzsche's obviously against that because he prefers the strong. But then he says very, very clearly towards the end of something, what was great about that, this enlarged the human soul. It enlarged the human soul, and the Jews actually became a very spiritualized people. And then since that time, right, in a sense, the possibilities of the soul have been greater. And so we see this happening over and over again throughout history. And you might even say, to give some support to the alt-right movement, they're spiritualizing their reaction to their liberal life, right? And so there's a psychological generation there, right? There's creativity. There are some dangers. There are some dangers. I won't say there are not dangers, but that it is a spiritualization and an enlargement, you might even say, of the youthful soul for some of these people. Of course, do you have to maybe guide it in the proper way, and think about it very clearly? Yes, but there's also that spiritualization that occurs.
Let's try to get one more question.
James Burnham wrote this book, Suicide of the West, in which he says that for the liberal, the preferred enemy is always to the right. And I have to admit, I chuckle when I hear hand-wringing about Nietzsche. Communists killed 100 million people, lasted for decades. Communist regimes lasted for decades. Many still exist. And so what's the inference to our reading of Marx and Lenin and Gramsci? So here's the question. Should we be as concerned about Marx and Lenin and reading them and people on the internet talking about them as we should be about Nietzsche?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I want to make a distinction between Nietzsche and Marx, which might be grounds for additional concern, as you say, which is that here's the great political difference, in my view, between Nietzsche and Marx. Marx provides what I said in my talk Nietzsche doesn't provide, political instructions. There's a regime, and it's elaborated, and its details are provided, and a party is made. and the party has a manifesto which is articulated. And so there's a sense in which, just on its face, Marx is infinitely more politically potent than Nietzsche, because Marx provides the equipment required to install, prolong, create a political movement with parties, with leaders, with a regime structure. I suppose, though, it's not, and so I began thinking Marx is infinitely more dangerous in a way to politics than Nietzsche. But it's not clear to me that by not precisely, and I tried to allude to this in my talk, by precisely not providing those things, Nietzsche doesn't provide license then for anything. And that is a considerably larger horizon of activity to engage in. After all, there are no limits. There is no party, so you can do whatever you would like in his name. And so while I do think Marxism is a concern, and you're right, it's played itself out on the world stage in a way that is equally terrifying as anything that happened in the 30s. But Nietzsche seems to me to be more open to misappropriation and therefore more volatile in character than Marx, who I happen to have many card-carrying Marxists in my classes, and I can predict what they're going to say before it comes out of their mouth, because it's all stated and there's a logic. Whereas with Nietzsche, it's not clear, as I said in my talk, what Nietzsche liberates a mind to do, or what he gives license to a mind to do. That's the only reflection I have.
So, right at the limit, I think we have time for one more. Let's keep the question brief and then the response brief, please.
Hi. So my question is, when Nietzsche said, this is kind of off topic from what we've talked about earlier, but when Nietzsche says God is dead, is he triumphant or lamenting? And how central is that to his ideas and what flows from it?
No, go for it. I think, go for it.
Well, I think you have to maybe look at 108 in The Gay Science if you want to see the first place where it's published. And there Nietzsche says that when Buddha died, his shadow was shown on the wall of the cave for many years afterward. And then he says God is dead, and that shadow is going to perhaps be shown for hundreds of years after. That means, I think, that the full meaning of the death of God has to play out over a long time because it's so significant. And the next place, 125 in The Gay Science, where Nietzsche announces it in the mouth of a madman who's running around saying, I seek God. And he's going into churches saying that, proclaiming that God is dead. He's talking to people who don't believe in God, but haven't understood that God is dead. That is, it's not atheism in a simple sense. And so it's not just atheism that needs to be faced. I think the sense of the place of God in human life, what's built upon it and what's derived from it in our understanding of our existence, that has to be really ferreted out and understood in order to really appreciate what is lost. And I think that Nietzsche, is both wants change and appreciates the powers of present conditions. So if present conditions are useful and powerful, even I think again in 61, he's not there proclaiming you have to get rid of religion. In fact, he suggests religion is very good for keeping lots of people feeling that their lives are meaningful and therefore alive. But he is, I think, also suggesting there's something else he wants to move on to. Or many somethings else, if I could put it that way. Anything else? Yeah.
Can I say one more thing?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I definitely think that one has to continue to grapple with Nietzsche's problem of the last man. And there is a grappling with that very problem within liberal traditions. So there is a critique of the last man in Mill and Tocqueville, as has been noted. But there's this enormous difference between that kind of critical, confrontation with the limitations of liberalism as we get them within the liberal tradition, as we get it from a radically illiberal thinker like Nietzsche. There's no, I'd articulate the difference in the following way, that both Mill and Tocqueville appreciate the nobility of the idea of democratic equality. And Nietzsche's incapable of that. Nietzsche's view is, and it's a principled view, that democratic equality is the most poisonous poison. And that you have to destroy societies that regard that as an ideal. And in order to do that, you have to destroy Christianity, because Christianity is where that ideal came from. And we're really, selling Nietzsche short if we don't appreciate the radicality of his challenge. It's not just becoming somewhat more self-conscious about liberalism limitations, but that he sees only its vices. There's the complete incapacity to see anything worthy or normatively attractive or noble about the ideals on which this society is founded. I mean, what he's rejecting, root and branch, is precisely the premises of a society like the United States. And it's strange to say, well, I love the regime, but I can't help but feel the force of Nietzsche. Well, there's a real problem there. It's an either or, and Nietzsche presents it as an either or. And the idea, well, we can somehow square the circle, it can't be done, and we have to, I think, face up to that. That's my last word. Anyone else?
All right, well, Paul, you want to? Our spirited audience. There we go.
So, Dr. Beiner, I started reading your book when I saw you were coming to campus. I think you have the most accurate interpretation of Nietzsche. Your book is highly perspective. I think you're one of the only establishment intellectuals who really takes serious whatever this fringe movement going on is. Very well written book.
Thanks.
My question is,
why don't you just stop there?
well, because it's important, it's important. And,
I knew there was more to come.
More to come.
Yeah.
My question is, when you have a lot of, intelligent people, high-ranking members of the military who say, listen, we like Bronze Age mindset, we like Nietzsche, we don't like what you have going on here. What do you think you can do to win those people back over to liberal democracy?
Oh my goodness. Well, I told you I was involved in this Twitter war in September, and I was the recipient of a tsunami of abuse, and I'm not exaggerating. And the idea of reasoning with BAP's fervent followers is a pretty hopeless project. The kind of people coming at me were not the sort of people with whom you can have a kind of reasoned philosophical discussion. Well, okay, let's talk about it. But it's shocking to me that so many people are comfortable with someone saying, "Well, I support military dictatorship. I support the complete trashing of any ideas of liberalism or equality or democracy, and let's have a regime committed to the kind of thing that the Nazis were committed to, which was trying to breed a superior race." I mean, are we that far removed from 1945 that we can't remember why?
But it's also crazy that you can walk down the street in Denver, Colorado, and someone's going to offer to sell you meth. You have people pouring into the country totally uninhibited. It's not like these people they don't have real grievances.
So you think BAP offers a solution to people selling meth on street corners? I
think the hard right offers. I think the hard right, as disgusting as it may be,
yeah.
I think they call it reactionary, right?
Yeah.
It's not even a reaction to nothing. So I think how about the return of the center right? What about that as an alternative?
Well, there was a center right. Hopefully, there still is a center right, but I can't see that anything could come from people being drawn to the far right, and that's what we're seeing more and more, and I can't help but be distressed by it.
So I hate to cut this short, it's a lively exchange, but I have a business transaction to get to on a street corner in Denver. So I'd just like to thank everybody for coming, and thank you.